know really well, some you want a little more explanation of. So I put through some old exams and pulled some questions up, plus I wrote some out. So the posterior surface of the heart is formed by which of the following structures?
Left ventricle.
I was thinking noise. What?
Is it the left ventricle?
Primarily.
Right.
Posterior surface. Left ventricle. It's kind of wrapped around. Most of the left ventricle is posterior. A third of it is anterior. And then all but the left auricle, or the left atrium, is posterior as well. Okay? So here you can see, this is the right ventricle here. So most of the posterior ventricular surface is due to left ventricle. And this is our left atrium. All right? And we see just a little bit of the right atrium here. So the primary component. So somebody asked me this morning, well, if you actually do the answers up there, how are we supposed to answer that on the test? I was like, well, depends on how it's written. If it's the short answer, and I'd say identify a structure which is a primary component of the posterior surface of the heart, then you could choose left atrium or left ventricle, all right? Or I could say right atrium, left ventricle, left atrium, and the answer A and B or B and C, you know, those are your favorite. All right, which of the following would function to increase blood pressure? So first of all, these terms can be a little scary because we don't use them every day, but you know what they mean. So where do we get the word adrenergic from? Adrenaline. And adrenaline is also comes from the adrenal gland. So that's primary epinephrine. But our neurotransmitter neuroepinephrine binds to the same receptors. Okay? So adrenergic refers to the sympathetic aspect of control. And agonist means that for an agonist, it means the effects are the same. It may not bind to the same receptor, but am I making this table look complicated? But it binds to its effects are the same. So, for instance, when we talk about digitalis, it ends up strengthening the force of the heart's contraction. It doesn't do so by binding to the neuroepinephrine receptor, but it does so by different means, but it's an agonist because it has the same effect as norepinephrine. Okay? A blocker is going to, so cholinergic refers to acetylcholine, and a blocker means it's going to keep acetylcholine from binding to its receptor. So when we have a blocker, it's going to suppress the acetylcholine function, thus allowing the sympathetic one to be the major effect. So it's like increasing sympathetic by pushing this one down, okay? So which of the five would function to increase blood pressure? So we're looking for sympathetic or parasympathetic activity. Okay, sympathetic, so adrenergic agonist. It's going to increase just like norepinephrine does. A cholinergic blocker would as well, because it's going to stop acetylcholine's effect and thus allow sympathetic to be the only one that's affecting it. MAO inhibitor. What is MAO? You guys remember? Okay. Oh, okay. So, when we were talking about the nervous system and we had the autonomic neuron releasing norepinephrine, and it binds to its receptor. Norepinephrine in the cell is removed by taking it back up into the presynaptic membrane.
See that? And it does what?
So we need to limit its effect. So remember, acetylcholine is broken down by acetylcholinesterase, released by this neuron. Norepinephrine is broken down by reuptake into the presynaptic cell, where it interacts with monoamine oxidase. Monoamine oxidase, and that breaks down norepinephrine. It also breaks down serotonin and dopamine. They share the same chemical structure. So that's going to remove norepinephrine from the synaptic cleft so we can fire again, so we have some control over how long it acts. So if we have an inhibitor, what's that going to do to the levels of norepinephrine? If we inhibit MAO, it's going to make it stay there. Okay? So an MAO inhibitor's effect is to increase the level of the neurotransmitter. So that's why it also would increase blood pressure. All right? For instance, I take a medication for my pituitary tumor, the bromocriptine, that we talked about in the case study. It's an MAO inhibitor. The drug that I was prescribed instead of codeine for my migraines is also an MAO inhibitor. And they're contraindicated to take together because when you get too much of either one, and serotonin crisis can occur, which is elevated blood pressure. Okay? For that reason, having too many MAO inhibitors means too much of the serotonin or the norepinephrine or the dopamine can be in the area. So an MAO inhibitor is going to stop breaking down norepinephrine. Thus, it's going to be like adding more epinephrine to the system. So that also would increase blood pressure. Cholinergic agonists. No, it's going to be like more acetylcholine. Acetylcholinesterase. It's going to break down the acetylcholine. Okay. And so, actually, I should have made that one red too. And cocaine. Cocaine works similar to an MAO inhibitor, except one step earlier, because cocaine blocks the reuptake. So to get the MAO to work, we have to uptake it. So there's transporters here. So cocaine blocks those transporters, so the norepinephrine never even gets to the MAO. So the effect is the same, more norepinephrine. Okay, which of the following would function to increase venous return? Ventricular fib, is that going to increase venous return? No, because it's a quivering, not a contraction. Now, if we had tachycardia, that may or may not, depending on how close the ventricular contractions are together. But VFib isn't even a full contraction. So exercise would. How does exercise increase ventricular return? Primarily. Yes, it increases heart rate, but the skeletal muscles squeeze. Remember we have the skeletal muscle pump, so we're squeezing the veins and pushing more blood back to the heart. So that's eventually, yes, that would mean more blood out, and so that would increase cardiac output. Plus exercise causes the sympathetic nervous system to fire and increase venous return. Atrial natriuretic hormone release. What does we learned that yesterday, we heard about it.
Slow it down.
So it's going to increase urine output or decrease urine output?
Increase.
Does it reabsorb the sodium or not reabsorb sodium?
Not.
It doesn't reabsorb sodium, so the water goes out with the urine. So blood volume is decreased, so venous return is decreased. Okay, increased cardiac output, like you were saying. Yes, what goes out has to come back again, so if we're putting more out, we ought to get more back. Aldosterone release. Yes, because that's the opposite of the atrial natriuretic. More sodium in, more water in, more blood volume, more blood returning to the heart. Diuretics? Nope, that's the same as our atrial natriuretic. The Valsalva maneuvers. You guys know what we would have done is if we'd done our blood pressure lab yesterday, we would have done a measurement of atrial pressure. Now, not all of you can visualize the dorsal venous arches on the backs of your hands, but if you hang your upper extremities down long enough, I can see a bit of a bulge over my tendons where the venous arches are crossing over those. All right, and if I look sideways, I can see a little bump. So if I raise my hand until that flattens out, gravitating, the pressure in my veins has just overcome the pressure in my artery, my right atrium. So I can make a line right there, okay? And if I estimate the level of my right atrium, and this is estimating, it's easier to do if I face this direction, my right atrium, and I measure that in millimeters, and your lab is a conversion of mercury millimeters to millimeters of mercury, and this comes out to around 3 to 5 millimeters of pressure. All right, which would be the venous pressure at the right atrium. So the Valsalva maneuver is trying to breathe out without letting the air out. So squeezing your abdominal muscles, raising your diaphragm, but keeping your glottis closed so the air doesn't get out. All right? So actually had one guy, nobody in his group wanted to do it, and he was slightly overweight, and he did it like 5 times. He ended staggering against the board. We were all grabbing him to keep him from sliding down, because it can make you go a little lightheaded because you're preventing outflow as well. So you go. And then finally, you have to raise your hand much higher to get the gravitational pressure to overcome the higher pressure in the intrathoracic cavity due to the squeezing of the abdominal muscles and the intercostal muscles. Okay? So that's the Valsalva maneuver. So it's squeezing the veins. As you can see, I had to raise my hand much higher to get that venous return. So Valsalva maneuver is going to decrease. So the pressure was so much greater because I was squeezing the vessel, so I had to decrease. I had to overcome. I would have had less blood returning, so I had to overcome that.
Which vessels are you squeezing?
And within the thoracic cavity, I'm squeezing the heart, and I'm squeezing the aorta, and I'm squeezing the vena cavas. By not just holding my breath, but trying to breathe out.
Oh,
So when you breathe out, you make the thoracic cavity smaller,
and then the diaphragm, I thought.
and the diaphragm goes, but I'm pushing it up with my abdominal muscles. So I'm squeezing my abdomen and pushing that up. No, I just made them last night. But people were taking pictures of them in the morning. Gretchen, are you taking?
Yeah, we'll have it on our YouTube channel too.
There's like 70 slides because I'm changing answers. Like I go from here to here.
The Valsalva
So-
maneuver, it's like blowing into a balloon, right?
Yeah,
Yeah. So
except
that's
you're
like
keeping you're trying to
Yeah.
blow, but you're keeping your airway closed. So like just squeeze without blowing out. And that increases intrathread. It's like trying to have a bowel movement.
Or have a baby.
Yeah, exactly. But you're supposed to breathe when you do those things. All right, so respiratory pump. When you breathe in, the opposite happens. When you breathe in, the abdomen diaphragm is lower, the thoracic cavity increases, and pressure is lowered, and that helps blood to flow in to the heart. So the breathing itself is increasing, decreasing is kind of a milking component. All right, which of the following happens at the end of isovolumetric relaxation? So isovolumetric relaxation is a term we used when we talked about the cardiac cycle. So when the heart's relaxing.
Is it C?
So again, if this was on the lecture exam, you would have the diagram. But if you look at our cycle, we have ventricular pressure doing this. Atrial pressure doing this. And aortic pressure doing that. Okay? So these two periods of time
Is it the
are our isovolumetric periods when all the 4 valves are closed. All
AD is open.
2 sets of valves are closed. So ventricular relaxation occurs on this side. Is this relaxation or is this relaxation?
Right.
This one is. So at the end of isovolumetric relaxation, we're at this line right here. All right? So are the semilunar valves open or closed
Up there, down there.
at this point?
Closed.
Semilunar valves are closing here. So they close at the beginning and they're still closed at the end. AV valves
Open.
open. So when AV valves open,
B.
beginning of ventricular filling, the semilunar valves close
At the top.
as soon as ventricular pressure drops below aortic pressure. So the aortic valves are closed, but they will have closed at the beginning of isovolumetric relaxation, not at the end. Does that make sense? That's why we have isovolumetric, because both sets of valves are closed. So semilunar valves will close at the beginning of isovolumetric relaxation. AV valves are already closed. And at the end of isovolumetric relaxation, AV valves open. Okay? So that's the beginning of ventricular filling. So is ventricular pressure lower than aortic pressure at that time?
Lower, yes.
Yeah, you can see it on the diagram. Is ventricular pressure lower than atrial pressure?
Yes.
Yes, that's why ventricular filling occurs, because the AV valves have opened. Okay?
Did you make that diagram?
Huh?
Did you make that diagram?
No? All right. The next question. The ECG strip indicates a slowing of the conductance of the impulse through ventricular contractile cells because of what? Now, before you get all nervous, what I told the morning
QRS.
class, what their assignment was over the weekend, was to develop the confidence
QR.
that they knew this material and not panic when they read a question like this. So I'm not asking you the cause of this ECG. All right, this is not a class in reading ECGs. So go back and read the question. We're looking at the change in ventricular contractile cells. What part of the ECG has to do with ventricular contractile cells? QRS and T wave. So what's happening to the ventricular contractile cells during the QRS?
Their ventricles are
What causes the
depolarizing.
QRS wave in our ECG?
Its ventricles are depolarizing.
Ventricular
Depolarization.
depolarization, okay? And the T wave is ventricular repolarization. So if we are decreasing the time it takes to conduct the current through the ventricular
A
cells,
shorter distance.
what's going to happen? That's depolarization, right? So we're looking at our QRS wave, and if we're increasing the time rather, slowing of the conductance, so we're increasing the time it takes for that
It's
to
the
occur, what's
PR.
going to happen to the QRS? It's going to widen, because it's going to take more. Remember, each little block is 0.04 seconds of time. So that's what you see here. The first thing is the tinting of the T wave. This happens in hypokalemia, but I'm not asking that. I'm just asking you to interpret the graph. All right? And so you can see this is a normal amount of potassium outside the cell. Then we go to 7, 8, 10, 11, and 12. And so you can see what's happening more dramatically here to here to here to here. It's taking longer for that wave to pass through the cells. And that's all this question is asking. So you don't even have to know that it's a potassium effect. All right? It means it's a reading of the ECG. Knowing that the QRS is ventricular contractile depolarization.
Oh, so it's
That was right.
Okay? But again, I don't want to go, wait a minute, I thought you're asking us to interpret the ECG. No, I'm asking you to, based on what we know about the ECG, what would this change, how would this change be indicated? Here I'm asking you to interpret the ECG.
Okay.
The enlarged P wave, what's shown in red here, on this ECG indicates what?
Oh.
Mitral.
Again, did you have to know that enlarged P waves are caused by mitral stenosis to read this from the answers that are based up there? No, you needed to know your ECG. So, AV nodal block, when is the current going through? What do we see at what point on our ECG is the current going through the AV node?
P.
During the P,
PQ.
R, PQ interval. Is that question about the PQ, PQR interval? No. All right. Prolonged conductance through the ventricles, we just saw that with the previous question. So that's going to be our QRS. Increased venous return. That's really not going to change the atria. Okay, so again, even if you didn't know what change in the ECG was due to mitral stenosis, you could pick out what area we're looking at, because when does the current go through the atria? P wave. With mitral stenosis, there's a backflow into the atria, it enlarges. And it takes longer for that to happen, so we see an enlarged keyway. I'm gonna get a little bit closer to
That's heart block.
reading it, to
The
interpreting an
myocardial
ECG.
infarction. Elevated ST.
Elevated ST segment, and that's what you can see here. The S doesn't go all the way down.
Heart attack, right?
Infarto. That's how I
Okay.
remember it.
I hope that's a test question.
This ECG illustrates,
The P and the.
remember these are made up, all right? An absent P wave is caused by atrial fibrillation, so I'm not making up the